You have exactly 100 milliseconds, 1/10 of a single second. It is literally the duration of a blink of an eye.
Wow.
Yeah, in the time it takes your eyelid to sweep down and back up,
Huh.
the person standing across from you, like the hiring manager, the potential client, whoever, has already made a foundational, deeply wired decision about your character.
Which is terrifying,
It
honestly.
really is. They have evaluated your trustworthiness, your baseline competence, and your overall likability. The verdict is fully in before you have even drawn the breath to say hello.
And, the sheer speed of that processing is staggering when you really break down what the brain is actually accomplishing in that window, because we are constantly fed this comforting, widely accepted myth.
Right, the whole 7 seconds thing.
Exactly. The myth that you have a solid 7 seconds to make a first impression, that you have time to walk into the room, adjust your posture, flash a warm smile, extend a hand.
Deliver the perfectly calibrated greeting.
Yeah, but the reality of human neurobiology tells a completely different, somewhat unnerving story. By the time you extend your hand, the most critical evaluation is already over.
I want to dig straight into the mechanics of this today for our deep dive, because it basically shatters everything we think we know about social interactions. Like when you look at the landmark Princeton University research by Alex Todorov.
Oh, that study is phenomenal.
It is. It fundamentally rewrites the timeline of human judgment. Because he wasn't tracking how people evaluate a conversation over a few minutes. He was flashing photographs of completely unknown faces onto a screen for that 100-millisecond window. Just a flicker.
Literally a tenth of a second.
Right. And the participants weren't just, vaguely registering that a face was present. They were assigning profound, complex personality traits to those faces.
And the methodology there is crucial to understand. When you ask people to rate a stranger's soul based on a 100-millisecond flash of a photograph, logic dictates that the results should be completely random.
Should just be statistical noise.
Exactly. How could anyone possibly assess whether someone is honest or intelligent based on a static, microscopic fraction of a second? But the data revealed this terrifying consistency.
Across thousands of participants, right?
Yeah. The judgments were nearly identical. People universally agreed on which faces were trustworthy, which were dominant, and which were competent, all based on less time than it takes a hummingbird to flap its wings.
And the implications bleed so far out of the laboratory. It's not just a quirky psychological party trick for us to talk about. These blink-of-an-eye judgments predict massive, high-stakes outcomes in the real world.
They absolutely do.
Like the faces that people consistently rated as highly competent in that tiny flash were overwhelmingly the faces of politicians who had actually won their real-world elections.
Yeah.
And the faces judged as untrustworthy correlated heavily with individuals who had been convicted of actual crimes.
We do have to be incredibly careful with how we interpret that correlation, though, because the immediate, cynical reaction is to think this proves some kind of biological determinism.
Like phrenology or something.
Exactly. That certain facial geometries make you a leader and other jawlines make you a criminal. That is absolutely not what the data suggests. There is no biological destiny at play here.
Thank goodness, because that would be a very, very dark timeline to live in. So what is actually happening then? Why do the snap judgments match the real-world outcomes so perfectly?
It really comes down to the compounding power of collective bias. The research demonstrates that human beings are overwhelmingly consistent in how we rapidly judge certain visual cues.
Okay, so we're all making the same mistake together.
Basically, yeah. If your baseline facial structure, your default expression, or your posture triggers a competent read in the first tenth of a second, almost everyone you meet will subconsciously tag you as competent.
Right.
Over a lifetime, that means teachers give you the benefit of the doubt, employers fast-track your promotions, and voters project leadership onto you. You are treated as competent, which affords you the actual opportunities to become successful.
It's a massive self-fulfilling prophecy powered by a 100-millisecond neurological reflex. And, on the flip side, if your resting face or your immediate micro-expressions trigger an untrustworthy read, you walk through life facing a headwind of constant unspoken skepticism.
Yeah, it's a huge burden. People withhold trust, they double-check your work. Juries view your mistakes as malice.
Which makes our mission for today's deep dive incredibly urgent for you listening. We're going to completely dismantle the hidden mechanics of rapid social judgment. We need to uncover the precise neurological pathways your brain is using before a single word is spoken.
We really need to look under the hood. What specific signals is the brain scanning for? Why is it making these judgments so fast?
And most importantly, how do you navigate this wildly automatic, highly biased biological machinery without compromising your authenticity. Because if you don't understand the rules of the first 100 milliseconds, you're essentially playing the game of life blindfolded.
That's a great way to put it. To even begin to take control of this, we have to look at the evolutionary hardware. Because I know when I first heard this, my immediate reaction was total defensive indignation.
Oh, totally. I want to believe I am a rational, objective, modern human being. I evaluate evidence. I listen to what people say. I don't just judge a book by its cover.
Right, the desire to believe we are purely rational is so strong, but we have to accept that the speed of first impression formation is not a cognitive flaw, it is a life-saving feature.
You have to strip away the boardroom, the coffee shop, the cocktail party, and basically rewind the clock to the ancestral savanna where the human brain actually evolved.
Exactly. In that environment, encountering a stranger was the ultimate high-stakes event. It was a literal life-or-death scenario every single time.
Right, because if another human approaches your camp, you don't have the luxury of sitting down for a nuanced debate about their long-term intentions.
You absolutely do not. If you pause to carefully analyze their vocal cadence, their socioeconomic indicators, and the finer points of their body language to logically deduce if they are a threat, and it turns out they are a threat, you're dead.
Your analytical, patient genes do not get passed on.
Nope. Survival required an immediate, rudimentary read of the situation. You needed to know instantly, friend or foe, can they kill me or can I kill them?
And evolution optimizes for speed over perfect accuracy in those moments. It's the classic idea that it's infinitely better to mistake a shadow for a predator and run away than to mistake a predator for a shadow and get eaten.
The cost of a false positive getting scared of a shadow is just a little wasted energy. The cost of a false negative ignoring a predator is death. So our brains developed an incredibly fast, highly reactive security system that operates entirely beneath the surface of conscious thought.
This is where the neuroscience gets so cool.
It really does. It relies heavily on subcortical processing. When you look at a new person, the visual data enters your eyes, travels along the optic nerve, and hits the visual thalamus.
Okay, let's unpack this, because from the visual thalamus, where does the data go? Because it doesn't just go to the logical thinking center, does it?
No, it splits. It takes two different roads simultaneously. The high road takes the visual data up to the visual cortex for complex processing, and eventually to the prefrontal cortex, which is the sophisticated, rational, slow-thinking part of your brain that handles logic and nuance.
But there is also the low road.
Yes, the low road. This is a direct, lightning-fast neural shortcut straight from the thalamus to the amygdala.
The amygdala being the almond-shaped structure deep in the temporal lobe that acts as our primary threat detection center, like our internal alarm bell.
Right. And the crucial mechanism here is that the low road to the amygdala is vastly faster than the high road to the prefrontal cortex. The amygdala receives the visual data, processes its emotional significance, scans for threat cues, and fires off a physiological response, a judgment before the prefrontal cortex has even finished rendering the high-resolution image of the person's face.
I love thinking about this structure like a massive, exclusive nightclub. Your brain has this highly reactive, incredibly jumpy bouncer standing outside the front door. The bouncer is the amygdala.
That's a perfect analogy.
A stranger walks up to the door, and the bouncer doesn't ask for a resume. He just looks at them and makes a snap, visceral decision in a fraction of a second. You look cool, you're in. You look dangerous, you're out. Just an immediate 100 millisecond vibe check.
The bouncer analogy works perfectly because of what happens next. After the bouncer has already made the decision and let the person in or thrown them out, the sophisticated manager of the club, the prefrontal cortex, comes strolling out to the front door a few seconds later.
And the manager likes to think they're in charge. So the manager looks at the person the bouncer just let in, and instead of actually doing a fresh, objective evaluation, the manager just writes up a logical-sounding report that justifies whatever the bouncer already did.
The manager is just doing PR for the bouncer. This is honestly the most humbling realization in all of social psychology. Conscious thought, when it comes to first impressions, is almost entirely a post hoc rationalization.
So we experience the interaction, and we tell ourselves a story. We're like, oh, I carefully evaluated this new colleague and decided I respect them because of their insightful comments.
But the biological reality is that your amygdala approved them a tenth of a second after you laid eyes on them, and your prefrontal cortex just spent the rest of the meeting selectively gathering evidence to prove the amygdala right.
It takes the ego completely out of it. You are forming opinions before you even consciously realize you are having an interaction. So if the amygdala is acting as this hypervigilant bouncer, What exactly is it looking for in that 100-millisecond scan?
Well, it can't be analyzing their entire life story. It has to be scanning for very specific elemental dimensions.
Right, so what are they?
Decades of cross-cultural psychological research have converged on a remarkably elegant finding here. Regardless of where you are in the world, what language you speak, or what the context of the meeting is, the bouncer is fundamentally assessing every new human on two core dimensions. The first dimension is warmth.
Warmth, which, just to clarify, isn't just about being bubbly or extroverted,
My
right? It's
favorite
about
one.
intent.
It is entirely about intent. The brain is asking the ancient survival question: what are this person's intentions toward me? Are they friendly? Are they trustworthy? Are they empathetic? Are they a friend or a foe? We evaluate warmth to determine if they are on our side.
Okay, and the second dimension.
The second core dimension is competence.
And if warmth is their intent, competence is their ability to execute that intent.
Exactly. You are evaluating their capability. Are they intelligent? Are they effective? Do they have status? Can they actually carry out whatever intentions they have? Together, these two dimensions, warmth and competence, account for over 80% of the variance in how we form global impressions of other people.
So your brain is instantly trying to plot every stranger you meet on a graph with warmth on the x-axis and competence on the y-axis.
Yes, but those two axes are not weighted equally in the brain's algorithm. From a survival standpoint, one of those is much more important.
Warmth, right. Warmth carries significantly more weight, and crucially, warmth is evaluated first. Always. Even in environments where you would think competence is all that matters.
Even in a high-stakes corporate board meeting or interviewing a brilliant neurosurgeon, you would assume the brain is desperately searching for competence signals first.
You really would.
But the amygdala prioritizes survival. A highly competent enemy is vastly more dangerous than an incompetent enemy. Therefore, your brain absolutely must know if the person is a friend or a foe before it even bothers to assess how capable they are.
So if you detect coldness or hostility, a lack of warmth, your brain immediately frames their competence as a threat.
This plays out in office dynamics every single day. We all know that one technically brilliant, highly competent person who is just a little prickly, they give off a slightly aloof, cold vibe when they walk into a room.
Oh, for sure. And that person will struggle massively in their career compared to someone who is perhaps 10% less brilliant, but who walks into the room broadcasting high warmth and trustworthiness.
Yep. When the brilliant but cold person proposes a great idea, the room's collective amygdala reads their lack of warmth as a threat, and people will instinctively look for flaws in their perfectly good idea. They won't know why they're pushing back. They'll just say, I'm not sure the data supports this.
While the warm, slightly less brilliant person proposes a mediocre idea and everyone rallies around it to make it work, it feels like unfair office politics, but it's actually just evolutionary biology executing its prime directive.
It is the hardwiring of human social cognition. We are biologically incapable of evaluating a person's competence independently of our initial read of their warmth. The warmth judgment creates a lens through which all subsequent competence data is viewed.
Which brings us directly to the psychological mechanism that locks these first impressions into place, the halo effect.
The halo effect. Once you understand this concept, you start seeing it everywhere. It explains so much irrational human behavior.
At its core, the halo effect is basically our brain's tendency to take one singular positive trait that we observe in someone and automatically assume they possess a whole constellation of other completely unrelated positive traits. Like, is the halo effect basically just a cognitive Instagram filter?
The cognitive smoothing is a perfect way to describe it. It is a massive cognitive shortcut. The brain loves efficiency. Evaluating every single facet of a human being's personality requires immense metabolic energy.
So if the bouncer at the door spots one glaringly obvious positive signal, say, the person is incredibly articulate or they have wonderful posture, the brain just paints a giant golden halo over their entire character.
It says they have a great speaking voice, therefore they must also be honest, hardworking, and deeply intelligent.
You apply the Paris filter or whatever, and suddenly everything about the picture is better. The lighting is softer, the blemishes disappear, the colors are warmer. The underlying reality of the photo hasn't changed at all, but the perception is flawlessly smoothed over.
And the most heavily researched, undeniably powerful trigger for this cognitive filter is the physical attractiveness bias. It is the most robust version of the halo effect in all of psychology.
We have to unpack the attractiveness bias because the data here is genuinely staggering. It feels incredibly unjust, but the brain does it automatically.
The research consistently demonstrates that people who possess genetic physical attractiveness, facial symmetry, clear skin, prototypical features are blindly rated by strangers as being significantly more intelligent, more competent, better leaders, and even more morally virtuous than less attractive people.
Wait, morally virtuous?
Ah,
The brain literally conflates a symmetrical jawline with a strong moral compass.
it does. It assumes that physical beauty correlates with inner goodness. And the real-world metrics are deeply alarming. In the corporate world, attractive candidates are routinely offered higher starting salaries for the exact same entry-level roles with identical resumes.
That's insane.
In academia, attractive students receive higher grades from professors on identical written essays. The professors unconsciously interpret the attractive students' writing more charitably.
But the courtroom data is where the halo effect gets truly dystopian.
The justice system data is the starkest proof of how unconscious this all is. Studies tracking real courtroom outcomes show that highly attractive defendants consistently receive lighter sentences, lower bail amounts, and more favorable jury verdicts than less attractive defendants who have committed the exact same crimes under the exact same circumstances.
And the terrifying part is that the judges handing down those lighter sentences are not consciously playing favorites. A judge doesn't sit there and think, well, he committed armed robbery, but he has amazing cheekbones, so I'll shave 5 years off.
Absolutely not. The judges are convinced they are being entirely objective. They will write detailed legal rationalizations for the lighter sentence. They will cite the defendant's potential for rehabilitation or demonstrated remorse.
They don't realize the cognitive Instagram filter completely altered how they perceived that defendant's remorse. The bouncer saw an attractive face, assigned a warmth halo, and the sophisticated legal mind of the judge simply wrote the report justifying it.
And this cognitive machinery works in the dark opposite direction as well. If the bouncer gets a negative read in the first 100 milliseconds, you get the horn effect.
The horn effect drops a dark, skeptical filter over the entire interaction. If your initial impression is poor, maybe you seem disheveled or your tone was slightly abrasive, everything you do afterward is viewed with deep suspicion.
If you make a tiny error, it is viewed as proof of your fundamental incompetence. If you do something genuinely kind, the other person will assume you have a manipulative ulterior motive. You are trapped beneath the horns.
So if these life-altering judgments are forming in a tenth of a second, and they are triggering these massive halos and horns, we need to talk about the data feeds. What specific visual and auditory inputs is the brain using to build this rapid assessment?
Because we know it's not just genetic attractiveness. We are broadcasting a tsunami of signals every second.
We are a continuous 24/7 radio station of nonverbal data. And one of the loudest signals we broadcast is our appearance, specifically our clothing and grooming.
Clothing is not just fabric, it is a highly concentrated packet of social information. It instantly signals your perceived status, your group affiliation, your self-awareness, and your respect for the interaction.
There's a brilliant study that isolates exactly how powerful clothing is as a cognitive signal. The suit study. I love this one.
The methodology of the suit study perfectly isolates the halo effect. Researchers took a single male subject. In one scenario, they dressed him in a sharply tailored, high-quality business suit. In the second scenario, the exact same man wore casual, somewhat unstructured street clothes.
And then they had observers rate him. Now, obviously, the observers rated the man in the suit as looking more professional. That's a given.
Right, that's just describing the clothes. But the halo effect bleeds into unrelated traits. The observers rated the man in the suit as significantly more confident and financially successful.
But the real shock was that they rated his underlying cognitive abilities higher.
Yes. When wearing the suit, people assumed he would perform better on complex, unrelated tasks. They assumed his intellect was sharper simply because of the structure of the wool draped over his shoulders. The suit acted as a massive competence signal, and the brain generalized that competence to his actual brain power.
We have to inject a heavy dose of nuance here, though, because the takeaway from that study is not, wear a three-piece tailored suit to every single event in your life and you will be viewed as a genius. Context is the ultimate variable in social signaling.
Context dictates the meaning of the signal. The phenomenon at play is social awareness. If you wear a tailored suit into an early-stage tech startup where the founders are walking around in hoodies and bare feet, you do not signal competence.
You signal that you are a time traveler from an 80s Wall Street movie. You look completely out of touch. You look like you fundamentally fail to understand the environment you are trying to enter. The bouncer in the startup founder's brain sees the suit and flags you as a foe, an outsider who doesn't get the culture.
Conversely, if you walk into a traditional law firm wearing a hoodie and sneakers, you aren't signaling disruptive creative genius.
Yeah.
You are signaling a profound lack of respect for their deeply established institutional norms.
So the universal rule of appearance isn't about maximum formality. It is about highly calibrated appropriateness. You want to decode the specific context and then aim to dress just slightly above the casual end of that specific spectrum.
It communicates, I understand your rules, I belong here, and I care enough to put in a margin of extra effort.
Which leads right into grooming, which feels like such a superficial, trivial thing to discuss when we are talking about high-level psychology, but the amygdala does not think grooming is trivial at all.
To the rapid processing centers of the brain, grooming is critical data. The neatness of your hair, the care of your fingernails, the basic geometry of your presentation, these are read by the brain as direct proxies for the personality trait of conscientiousness.
Conscientiousness being the trait associated with organization, discipline, and attention to detail.
Yes. Grooming requires executive function. It requires planning and daily effort. When someone presents as impeccably groomed, the observer's brain subconsciously registers that effort. It thinks this person pays attention to the small details of themselves, therefore they will pay attention to the details of their work, and they respect the social contract.
And because of the halo effect, that high conscientiousness signal gets translated into a perception of higher overall intelligence and trustworthiness.
Exactly. Okay, so that is the outer layer, the packaging. Let's move to the physical body itself. Body language is a term that gets thrown around a lot, but the underlying biology of what our bodies are broadcasting is fascinating. Let's start with the foundation, posture.
Posture is perhaps the most ancient, primal signal we possess. It predates human language by millions of years. In the animal kingdom, physical space equates to status and confidence.
An open, upright, expansive posture, shoulders rolled back, chest exposed, head level, is a universal signal of high status and low anxiety. You are exposing your vital organs because you do not fear attack.
Whereas a contracted posture, shoulders hunched forward, arms crossed, chest concave, head down, is the universal biological signal for submission, anxiety, or defensiveness. You are physically making yourself a smaller target and protecting your core.
What is truly revolutionary about posture, though, is how it works internally. It is not just an external broadcast to other people. It is an internal feedback loop to your own endocrine system. The Harvard research pioneered by Amy Cuddy fundamentally shifted how we view this.
Oh, the expansive posture research. This is the ultimate fake-it-till-you-make-it biological hack.
It is a physiological hack. The research demonstrates that deliberately adopting an expansive posture, making your body take up more space for just a couple of minutes before a high-stakes interaction, doesn't just change how you look, it physically alters your hormonal profile.
Really? Just standing differently changes your hormones.
Yes. It significantly lowers your levels of cortisol, which is the primary stress hormone that causes anxiety and brain fog. Simultaneously, it can elevate feelings of power, groundedness, and risk tolerance.
So you are literally tricking your brain into feeling the confidence that your body is mimicking. The bouncer sees the expansive posture from the inside and says, "Oh, we must be safe and in charge. Let's stand down the alarm."
Exactly. Moving up from the torso, we hit the most volatile channel of nonverbal communication, eye contact. Navigating eye contact in a first impression is the ultimate Goldilocks problem. The margins for error are incredibly slim, and the penalties for getting it wrong are severe.
Let's talk about the extremes. Too little eye contact. You are in a meeting and the person won't look at you. They are staring at their notebook, looking at the floor, letting their eyes dart around the room. How does the bouncer read that?
The amygdala interprets active gaze aversion as one of two things profound: overwhelming anxiety or active deception. When someone avoids your eyes, the primitive brain instantly thinks, what are they hiding? Why won't they let me see your intentions?
It is a massive warmth penalty and a massive competence penalty simultaneously. You read as untrustworthy and weak.
But the other extreme is almost worse. The unblinking laser beam stare. We have all been trapped in a conversation with someone who locks eyes and refuses to look away. It makes your skin crawl.
Because biologically, an unbroken stare is a mammalian threat display. It is the gaze of a predator tracking prey or a rival preparing to attack. It signals aggressive dominance and a complete lack of social calibration. It triggers the other person's fight or flight response.
So the optimal zone, the just right porridge, is engaged but relaxed. You maintain eye contact while the other person is speaking to show active listening. When you are speaking, you maintain contact to emphasize points, but you naturally break your gaze periodically, looking slightly to the side or up as you process a thought or access a memory before returning to their eyes.
It signals that you are fully present and confident, but not hunting them.
Mm.
Speaking of tactile physical connection, we have to dissect the handshake.
Oh, the handshake.
In Western professional cultures, the handshake is a heavily loaded make-or-break ritual. It's a relic of showing you didn't have a weapon in your hand, but now it's a proxy for your entire professional character.
Right.
And there is actual hard data on how a handshake changes memory, right?
There is. The Income Center for Trade Shows conducted a fascinating study tracking interactions in highly chaotic, high-volume professional settings. They found that participants were twice as likely to remember an individual if they had engaged in a physical handshake with them, compared to individuals they only greeted verbally.
Twice as likely.
The physical, tactile connection drops a massive cognitive anchor in the brain. It elevates the interaction from a mere visual and auditory event to a physical experience. But as we all know, a bad handshake is worse than no handshake at all.
Oh, absolutely. The variations of terrible handshakes are endless. You have the dead fish, where they just offer you 4 limp, lifeless fingers. That instantly communicates a lack of energy, deep insecurity, or just a total lack of commitment to the interaction.
And then you have the overcompensating bone crusher.
Yeah, the person who tries to shatter your knuckles to establish alpha dominance,
But
which just makes you instantly dislike them and want to wash your hand.
the mechanics of the perfect neuro-optimizing handshake are precise. First, it requires full web-to-web, palm-to-palm contact. It cannot just be the fingers. Palm contact signals openness. Second, it must be firm, signifying presence, but never crushing.
And the true secret of a masterful handshake is pressure matching. You should instantly sense the grip strength of the other person and intuitively match it. This creates an immediate, subconscious physical parity. It physically communicates mutual respect. Add 2 or 3 deliberate pumps from the elbow, not the wrist, and release.
Okay, we've touched hands, we've made eye contact. Now, the face. Let's talk about smiles. Because the human brain has an incredibly sophisticated radar for smiles. There are smiles, and then there are smiles.
The human face is arguably the highest bandwidth communication device in the natural world, and the brain devotes massive neural real estate to decoding it. The foundational research here comes from Paul Ekman, who spent his career mapping the microexpressions of the face.
He fundamentally separated smiles into 2 distinct categories. The holy grail of warmth signaling is what psychology calls the Duchenne smile.
The Duchenne smile. What is the anatomical difference between a Duchenne smile and a regular smile?
It's all about the specific cranial nerves and muscle groups involved. A fake smile, often called a Pan Am smile after the forced cheerfulness of old airline attendants, only involves the lower half of the face. The motor cortex fires a signal to the zygomatic major muscles, which physically pull the corners of your lips upward. That's it. Your mouth is smiling, but the top half of your face is dead.
And the bouncer in the brain sees that dead-eyed smile and immediately raises the alarm.
Because a fake smile actually registers in the observer's brain as a deception signal. When you flash a Pan Am smile, the other person's amygdala interprets it as less trustworthy than a completely neutral, unsmiling face. You are wearing a mask, and the brain knows it.
So how does the Duchenne smile work? Why does it read as authentic?
Because it operates on an entirely different neural pathway. A genuine Duchenne smile doesn't originate in the conscious motor cortex. It originates deep in the emotional centers of the basal ganglia and the limbic system. When you experience a genuine moment of positive emotion, the brain simultaneously fires the zygomatic major to lift the mouth, and it fires the orbicularis oculi muscles.
The orbicularis oculi, those are the sphincter muscles around the eyes, right?
Yes. They contract, causing the outer corners of the eyes to crinkle into what we call crow's feet, and they physically lower the brow slightly. You cannot consciously command the orbicularis oculi to contract reliably without looking completely deranged. It only happens reflexively when the emotion is real.
So the bouncer in my brain is literally scanning the microscopic muscle contractions around your eyes to determine if your joy is neurologically authentic. That is mind-blowing. And it means the only way to deploy a Duchenne smile is to actually stop faking it. You have to find something genuinely positive about the moment, create a spark of real connection, and let the limbic system do the work.
The most effective technique is profound authenticity. Now, we've covered the visual packaging, but the instant you open your mouth to speak, a completely different, equally primal data stream hits the observer's brain, your voice.
Before they process the vocabulary or the grammar of what you're saying, they are processing the acoustics.
Long before the language centers decode the words, the older, more primitive parts of the brain are analyzing the pitch, the volume, the resonance, and the pace of your vocal cords. And they are using that acoustic data to make sweeping judgments about your status and competence. Look at the incredibly revealing study out of Duke University regarding corporate CEOs.
This study is wild. The researchers analyzed the audio of hundreds of male CEOs giving presentations or speaking on earnings calls. They just mapped the acoustic pitch of their voices.
And they found a direct, statistically significant correlation between vocal pitch and corporate success. CEOs who possessed a naturally lower-pitched, deeper, resonant voice-led companies with vastly larger assets, and they personally took home significantly higher compensation packages.
Why in the world would vocal cord thickness correlate to managing a larger supply chain or higher profit margins? It makes no logical sense.
Logically, it makes zero sense.
Bro.
Evolutionarily, it makes perfect sense. This is a relic of our mammalian heritage. In almost all mammal species, the pitch of a vocalization is directly correlated with the physical size of the animal. A deep roar comes from a massive chest cavity. A high-pitched squeak comes from a small animal. Deep pitch signals physical dominance, high testosterone, and threat capacity.
So when a modern board of directors sits around a mahogany table and listens to a candidate with a deep, booming baritone voice, their primitive lizard brains are subconsciously whispering, "This guy is huge, he is the alpha, he'll protect the tribe, give him the job."
Exactly. They misattribute the acoustic signal of physical dominance as a signal of executive competence. It is the halo effect channeled through audio. Now, you cannot permanently change your natural pitch without straining your vocal cords, but you can control the pace and the volume of your speech, which are equally powerful signals.
Pace is fascinating because when we get nervous, when the stakes are high in that first impression, almost all of us speed up. We talk faster.
Speaking rapidly is an incredibly common anxiety leak. When you speak fast in a high-stakes environment, you are implicitly broadcasting a message to the room. You are saying, "I know my time is limited, I know I might be interrupted at any second, and I am terrified of losing your attention, so I must rush to get my words out." It signals a distinct lack of authority.
Whereas a slow, measured, deliberate pace signals the exact opposite.
Slow speech is the ultimate acoustic power move. When you speak with a relaxed, grounded pace, leaving comfortable pauses between sentences, you are implicitly signaling, "I possess absolute authority here. I know my ideas are valuable. I know you will wait for me to finish. And I have zero fear of being interrupted." The brain hears that slow pace and instantly assigns a massive competence and status halo to the speaker.
And then we hit the issue of accents. And this is where the neurobiology of first impressions stops being just a quirky savanna survival tool and becomes a deeply unfair modern barrier. We have to address the unconscious bias against non-native accents.
It is a profound systemic issue. Decades of linguistic and psychological research demonstrate an undeniable bias. Listeners will routinely rate speakers with non-native accents as being less intelligent, less trustworthy, and less competent than native speakers. And the most crucial detail is that this happens even when the researchers use transcripts to ensure the exact same words, grammar, and ideas are being communicated.
So a native speaker says a sentence, and a non-native speaker says the identical sentence, and the brain rates the non-native speaker as less smart. Why? Is it just pure xenophobia?
It is largely driven by a neurological phenomenon called the fluency heuristic. The human brain, as we've noted, is profoundly lazy. It loves processing information that is easy and smooth. When we listen to a native speaker, the brain processes the phonetics effortlessly. When we listen to a non-native accent, the brain has to work slightly harder. It has to expend a tiny bit more metabolic energy to decode the acoustic signal. It experiences cognitive friction.
And the brain misinterprets that friction.
Yes. The listener's brain feels the processing difficulty, and instead of realizing, "Oh, I'm having a slightly harder time decoding the vowel sounds," the brain lazily projects that difficulty onto the speaker's intellect. It thinks this information is hard to process, therefore this speaker's ideas must be confusing or lacking in competence.
It misattributes acoustic friction as intellectual deficit. And the worst part is the listeners usually have no idea they're doing it. If you confront them, they will swear they are only evaluating the merit of the ideas. They don't realize their prefrontal cortex is being puppeted by the fluency heuristic.
It is entirely unconscious, which makes it incredibly insidious for anyone navigating a globalized professional world. We will discuss specific strategies for mitigating this later, because it requires active, deliberate compensation.
Okay, let's step back and look at the architecture we've built. We know the judgment happens in 100 milliseconds. We know the bouncer is evaluating warmth and competence. We know the data comes from this massive array of inputs: clothing, posture, microexpressions, vocal acoustics. But here is the massive question that hangs over all of this. If these impressions are formed so ridiculously fast, based on such incredibly superficial, low-resolution data, why on earth are they so permanent?
It's a great question.
Why can't we just meet someone, get a bad vibe, and then 5 minutes later, when they say something smart, instantly update our opinion? Why is the first impression seemingly written in stone?
To understand the permanence of the first impression, you have to understand the brain's relationship with its own energy and its own ego. Updating a belief requires significant metabolic effort. It requires dismantling neural connections and building new ones. The brain hates doing that. It much prefers to build a model of reality and then stubbornly defend it. This brings us to the inescapable gravity well of confirmation bias.
Confirmation bias. We hear this term weaponized a lot in political discourse, but its primary function is in how we navigate everyday social reality.
Confirmation bias is the brain's deeply ingrained automatic tendency to actively seek out, disproportionately weight, and flawlessly remember any information that confirms a belief it already holds. Simultaneously, it actively ignores, dismisses, degrades, or simply forgets any information that contradicts that pre-existing belief.
So if the 100-millisecond bouncer decides someone is a genius, the prefrontal cortex becomes a defense attorney whose only job is to prove the bouncer right.
That is exactly the mechanism. Let's look at how this operates in a controlled setting. Researchers designed a brilliant experiment to isolate confirmation bias in social settings. They recruited a group of participants and told them they were going to have a brief conversation with a stranger.
But before the conversation, they planted a seed.
They preloaded the mental filter. They took half the participants and casually gave them a highly positive biography of the stranger. They said, "You're going to meet John. John is known for being incredibly warm, insightful, and generous with his time." They took the other half of the participants and gave them a negative biography. "You're going to meet John. He can be a bit cold, evasive, and self-centered."
Setting up a positive halo for Group A and a negative horn for Group B.
Then both groups actually went in and met John. But John wasn't a random person. John was a highly trained actor. His instructions were to behave in the exact same, heavily rehearsed, perfectly neutral, slightly ambiguous manner for every single interaction. He used the same neutral tone, the same mild body language, the same non-committal answers.
The raw data of the interaction was identical across the board.
Identical. But when the researchers pulled the participants out and asked them to evaluate the interaction, the results were a perfect split reality. The group primed with the positive description raved about John. They rated his neutral, quiet behavior as proof of his thoughtfulness and his respectful listening skills. The confirmation bias searched for warmth and found it in his silence.
And the negative group.
The negative group, watching the exact same silence, rated John as aloof, painfully awkward, and rudely evasive. They said he wouldn't even engage with me. Their confirmation bias searched for coldness and found it in the exact same quiet behavior. The initial expectation completely overrode objective reality.
There's another layer to this cognitive stickiness, which is the sequence of the information. The timeline matters just as much as the content. This is the primacy effect. I want to walk through this specific study, the classic Solomon Asch adjective experiment, because when I first read it, it completely changed how I think about introducing myself.
The Asch study is the foundational text on the primacy effect. It demonstrates how fragile our logical processing really is.
So Asch takes two groups of people. He goes to Group A, and he reads them a list of 6 adjectives describing a hypothetical person. The adjectives are intelligent, industrious, impulsive, critical, stubborn, and envious.
A trajectory moving from highly positive, competence-based traits down into deeply negative, anti-social traits.
Right. Then he goes to Group B. He describes the exact same hypothetical person, he uses the exact same 6 words, but he just reverses the chronological order in which they are spoken. He tells Group B the person is envious, stubborn, critical, impulsive, industrious, and intelligent. The raw data input is 100% identical, but the outcome is wildly different. Group A forms a very positive, robust impression of the person. Group B forms a highly negative, suspicious impression. How does the brain justify doing that?
Because of how the brain builds cognitive scaffolding, the primacy effect dictates that whatever information enters the brain first doesn't just sit on a shelf waiting for the rest of the data. The first piece of information actively constructs the interpretive framework for everything that follows.
It builds the house, and everything else has to fit inside it.
Let's trace the neurologic for Group A. The very first word they hear is intelligent. Boom. A competence halo is instantly established. The brain says, okay, we're dealing with a smart person. So as the list gets darker, the brain uses that intelligence scaffolding to rationalize the negative traits. When it hits the word stubborn, the brain spins it. It says, well, they are highly intelligent, so of course they are stubborn. They know they are right. They have strong convictions. That's a sign of leadership.
The halo bends the negative trait into a positive light. It contextualizes it as a strength.
But look at the tragic architecture of Group B. The very first word their brain processes is envious. Instantly, a heavy negative horn effect descends. The scaffolding is built on toxicity. So as the list gets more positive, the brain weaponizes the good traits. When it finally hears the word intelligent at the very end of the list, the brain doesn't say, oh, great, they are smart. The brain says, wait, they are deeply envious, incredibly stubborn, and they are highly intelligent. That makes them a dangerous, cunning, manipulative sociopath. The exact same word intelligent becomes a threat amplifier because of the frame set by the first word.
This translates directly into what happens when we start a new job or join a new team. The first few days create the primacy scaffolding for your entire tenure at that company.
It establishes your psychological bank account with your manager and your colleagues. This is the massive so what of the confirmation bias research. If you actively manage your signals, you show up well-groomed, you make great eye contact, you listen actively, you deploy warmth, you establish a massive credit balance in your psychological account.
You build an intelligent and industrious scaffold in your boss's brain.
Yes. And because you are human, in month 2, you are going to make a mistake. You are going to blow a deadline or mess up a presentation. But because you have a credit balance, your boss's confirmation bias will kick in to protect their initial positive impression of you. They will rationalize your failure. They will say, oh, the client must have given them bad data, or they are just stretching their wings. They're still a top performer. The negative event is explained away.
You are protected by the halo. But if you walk in on day 1 and operate in a deficit,
if you come in aloof, anxious, or unprepared, you build an envious and stubborn scaffold. When you make that exact same presentation mistake in month 2, the boss's confirmation bias pounces on it as glorious validation. They think, aha, I knew it the moment they walked in. They are incompetent and sloppy. Once you are in that deficit, it takes an exhausting, disproportionate amount of sustained, flawless work to ever dig your way back to neutral, because every success is viewed with suspicion.
it is exhausting just contemplating the invisible math happening in the background of every meeting. But let's add a massive layer of complexity to this. Everything we have discussed so far, the amygdala, the halo effect, confirmation bias, these are universal human hardware features. Every brain does this. But the actual software, the specific signals that trigger the bouncer, those are not universal. They are deeply culturally programmed.
This is the crossroads where biology collides with sociology, and it is where the most devastating professional and personal misunderstandings occur. The biological machinery is identical. Everyone evaluates for warmth and competence. But the physical gestures and behaviors that communicate warmth and competence vary wildly and often directly contradict each other across different cultural landscapes.
Let's run through the specific friction points because they happen constantly in global business.
Yeah.
We already talked about the American ideal of eye contact, direct, sustained, unbroken. In the U.S., that equals honesty and competence.
But take that exact same American behavior and place it in many East Asian cultures, particularly in a hierarchical corporate setting in Japan or South Korea. In those contexts, locking prolonged direct eye contact with the superior is not read as confidence. It is a hostile threat display. It signals aggressive challenge, a lack of humility, and profound disrespect. The culturally programmed signal for respect, warmth, and appropriate deference in that context is to actively avert your gaze downward.
So you have an American manager who feels disrespected because the Japanese employee won't look them in the eye. The American thinks they're hiding something, they lack confidence. Meanwhile, the Japanese employee is actively trying to show the utmost respect by lowering their eyes, and they think the American manager's intense staring is aggressive and destabilizing.
They are both executing the correct behavioral software for their respective cultures perfectly, and they are achieving total communication failure.
The greeting rituals are another massive minefield. We talked about the American power handshake, the firm grip, the pumps, the match to pressure.
Take that aggressive, firm, knuckle-locking handshake to many parts of the Middle East, and it is entirely inappropriate. In many Middle Eastern business cultures, the appropriate greeting between men often involves a much lighter, softer, lingering touch of the hands. It is designed to signal warmth, personal connection, and brotherhood, not dominant, aggressive business parity. If you come in with a bone crusher, you signal a cold, transactional aggression.
And then you have the Japanese bow, which is an art form of social signaling.
The bow is incredibly precise. The depth of the bow, the duration, the angle it communicates a highly nuanced matrix of relative status, deep respect, and the precise nature of the relationship. It carries all the heavy social data of a Western handshake, but the physical execution is completely alien to the Western brain.
Here is the cultural difference that I think causes more visceral panic in Americans than anything else, the cultural relationship with silence.
Silence is a massive cultural divider. In American and many Western European cultures, silence during a conversation is perceived as a critical failure of the interaction. It is awkward. It signals that someone has lost the thread, or someone is bored, or there's unexpressed anger. The American biological reflex is to immediately rush in and fill the void with words, any words, just to relieve the pressure of the silence.
I am completely guilty of this. If there are 4 seconds of silence on a Zoom call, I will start talking about the weather just to stop the pain.
But in Finnish culture, or Japanese culture, and many indigenous cultures globally, silence is not a void to be filled. It is a feature of high-level communication. A comfortable, prolonged silence during a negotiation or after someone makes a point is a profound signal of mutual respect. It communicates, I am taking what you just said so seriously that I'm going to sit here and deeply process it before I insult you with a knee-jerk response.
So the American rushes in to fill the silence to save the meeting.
And the Finnish colleague watches the American babbling to fill the space, and the Finnish bouncer thinks this person is superficial, they are highly anxious, they have no impulse control, and they are not taking this negotiation seriously.
It is a complete cross-cultural collision, and it extends to how we structure our arguments too. The directness issue.
The clash of directness is legendary. The level of blunt, unvarnished directness that signals strong, confident competence in a German boardroom where you might say, your proposal is flawed in these 3 specific areas, we must fix them, will be interpreted as shocking, unprovoked hostility in a British boardroom.
And the British response.
The British cultural norm of indirectness, saying something like, I suppose we might perhaps consider looking at these few areas that could potentially be optimized, signals diplomatic sophistication and high warmth in London. But if a British executive uses that phrasing in Germany or America, the listeners will assume the British executive lacks confidence in their own data or is being intentionally evasive and sneaky.
This maps perfectly onto anthropologist Edward Hall's framework of high context versus low context cultures.
It is the master key to understanding these collisions. In a low context culture, like the United States, Germany, or Scandinavia, communication is highly explicit. The meaning is entirely contained within the literal words spoken. You spell everything out, you put it in a contract. In a high-context culture like Japan, China, or many Middle Eastern cultures, the literal words are only a small fraction of the communication. The vast majority of the meaning is implicit. It is carried in the context of the room, the historical relationship between the families or companies, the subtle nonverbal cues, and crucially, what is left unsaid.
So when a low-context American walks into a high-context meeting in Tokyo, the misreadings are guaranteed.
The American walks in, asks direct, probing personal questions to try and build warmth, speaks loudly to show confidence, and makes intense eye contact to show honesty. The American thinks they are nailing the first impression. The high-context hosts are experiencing a sensory and social assault. They view the American as violently intrusive, childishly overly familiar, and completely lacking in refinement.
Well, the American looks at the high-context hosts, their quiet reserve, their indirect answers, their long silences, and the American thinks, these people are cold, they're hiding something, they are uncooperative.
And the tragedy is, neither side is wrong. Both sides are behaving with perfect honor and appropriateness according to their own cultural software. They are just fundamentally misreading the other side's code. This is why developing cultural intelligence, the ability to pause your own biological bouncer and ask, wait, what does this signal mean in their context, is the most vital skill in modern global business.
Okay, we have covered a massive amount of ground. We've talked about the unstoppable 100 millisecond amygdala reflex, the insurmountable halos and horns, the iron grip of confirmation bias, the cultural minefields. Listening to all this biological, deeply wired data, it can feel incredibly paralyzing. It feels like we're just passengers strapped in our own meat suits, completely at the mercy of evolution and bias. So I have to ask the practical question, can we actually control any of this?
The answer is a highly qualified yes. But we have to fundamentally redefine what control means in this context. You cannot achieve perfect control. You cannot rewrite the base code.
So what is off the table? What can we absolutely not control?
You cannot change your fundamental facial geometry. You cannot alter the resting resonant pitch of your vocal cords. Most importantly, you cannot reach into the brain of the person sitting across from you and turn off their amygdala. You cannot dismantle their confirmation bias. Those are the laws of physics and social psychology.
Okay, so if the algorithm is locked, what can we do?
You cannot change the algorithm, but you have absolute control over the data inputs you feed into that algorithm. You manage the signals. The goal here is never to perform a fake personality. The bouncer will detect the Pan Am smile. The goal is to make deliberate, highly conscious choices about your preparation, your physical presence, and your focus, to ensure that the signals you broadcast are an accurate, unclouded representation of who you actually are on your best day. You want to remove the static.
And the single biggest source of static, the loudest negative signal we broadcast, is anxiety, which makes preparation the ultimate life hack.
Preparation is the most unglamorous yet most effective strategy for managing first impressions, because anxiety is a massive warmth and competence leak. When you are anxious, the bouncer in the other person's brain sees the erratic eye contact, hears the fast, wavering voice, and sees the closed posture. The bouncer interprets that anxiety as either this person is incompetent and out of their depth, or this person is terrified because they are hiding something.
Anxiety mimics deception and incompetence.
It does. And the only reliable way to kill the physiological roots of anxiety is through overwhelming, obsessive preparation. Know the cultural context of the room. Know exactly what your opening sentence will be. Anticipate the difficult questions. When you have done the deep, invisible work beforehand, it naturally produces a state of grounded, quiet confidence. Your nervous system settles. Your posture naturally opens up. Your vocal pace slows down. That grounded presence is the most powerful, unfakeable, positive signal you can send.
There's another strategy from the research that I absolutely love because it feels like a total psychological paradox. It's the paradox of interest.
It completely upends how most people approach networking or socializing.
Because the standard logic goes, I'm walking into a room, I want to make a great impression, I want people to think I am smart and competent, therefore, I need to talk about myself, and to casually drop my accomplishments, show off my vocabulary, and prove my worth. But the data says doing that actually damages your impression.
Yes. The single most consistent finding across decades of research on likability and perceived competence is this. The people who are universally rated as the warmest, most trustworthy, and ironically the most intelligent are the people who spend the least amount of time talking about themselves.
The paradox of interest. The best way to make a great impression of yourself is to completely focus your attention away from yourself.
Exactly. When you enter an interaction and you ask real, thoughtful, open-ended questions about the other person, and crucially, when you actually shut down your internal monologue and deeply listen to their answers, you trigger a cascade of positive neurological events.
How does it work biologically?
When you show genuine curiosity about another human being's experience, you organically create real engagement. That engagement naturally fires your limbic system, which automatically deploys the authentic Duchenne smile. Your body language naturally leans in. But more importantly, look at what is happening in their brain. You are giving them the floor. You are making them feel seen, heard, and deeply valued.
And human beings are addicted to feeling valued.
We are. And through the psychological process of classical conditioning, they take that warm, validating, wonderful feeling of being heard, and they subconsciously associate it entirely with you. They walk away from the conversation thinking, wow, that person was absolutely brilliant and so charismatic, even if you only spoke for 10% of the time. You gave them the gift of attention, and they repaid you with a massive halo effect.
A very subtle, surgical way to amplify that feeling of value is the deliberate use of names.
A person's name is the sweetest sound in any language to their own brain. Our auditory processing centers are specifically tuned to pick our own names out of a noisy room. When you use someone's name, ensuring you have the pronunciation flawlessly correct and using it naturally, not forcing it like a sleazy car salesman, it acts as a profound warmth signal. It tells their bouncer, I didn't just log your job title, I logged your humanity. I see you as an individual. Anchoring an introduction with their name and using it once more organically during the conversation locks in a sense of personal connection.
I want to circle back to the accent bias we discussed, because we promised actionable strategies. If you are a non-native English speaker navigating a Western corporate environment, and you are fully aware that this unfair, unconscious fluency heuristic is operating against you, what do you do? The answer cannot be spend thousands of hours trying to erase your native accent to appease biased listeners.
Absolutely not. Attempting to entirely eliminate a native accent is a fool's errand. It is emotionally exhausting, it strips away a core piece of your identity, and practically speaking, it is usually impossible to achieve perfectly under stress anyway. The strategy is not erasure, the strategy is active, overwhelming compensation.
How do you compensate for a biological processing glitch in someone else's brain?
You overwhelm their unconscious bias with undeniable conscious competence signals. The bias operates at the level of the bouncer. It's a snap judgment based on cognitive friction. But you can bypass the bouncer by engaging the listener's prefrontal cortex with overwhelming substance within the
Look and sound like.
First, you must completely abandon the desire for speed. A massive mistake many non-native speakers make is trying to speak very rapidly, believing that speed equals fluency. But speaking quickly with an accent drastically increases the cognitive friction for the listener. It makes the bouncer panic.
So you do the opposite.
You actively slow down, slower than you think you need to. You articulate your consonants deliberately. You utilize confident structural pauses between your points. And as we've already established, a slow, deliberate speaking pace is universally recognized as a signal of high status and authority. By slowing down, you decrease the cognitive friction and simultaneously increase your dominant signal.
And the content itself.
The content must be unassailable. You combine that deliberate pacing with extreme preparation. You provide clear agendas. You structure your arguments flawlessly. If a non-native speaker speaks slowly, clearly, and delivers a brilliant, data-backed, highly structured analysis, the listener's prefrontal cortex is forced to engage. The conscious brain will eventually look at the undeniable quality of the work and override the automatic bias of the bouncer. The accent acts as a first impression tax. It raises the initial hurdle. It is deeply, fundamentally unfair. But with structural clarity and overwhelming substance, it is a hurdle you can absolutely vault over.
Okay, let's take this entire toolkit, the posture, the preparation, the warmth-first approach, and put it into action. Let's step into the arenas where the stakes are the absolute highest, starting with the undisputed heavyweight champion of high-stakes social evaluation, the job interview.
The job interview is perhaps the most fascinating psychological theater in modern society, primarily because it is built on a foundational self-deception.
A self-deception. By who, the candidate or the company?
By the company. The nominal stated purpose of a one-hour job interview is a rational, objective evaluation of a candidate's hard skills, their historical experience, and their cognitive ability to solve complex problems. That is what human resources believes is happening. But in neurobiological reality, the interview is something else entirely. It is a massive, highly volatile 15-second first impression formation exercise, followed by 59 minutes and 45 seconds of pure confirmation bias.
This brings us to the 15-second rule, Frank Bernieri's study at Oregon State University. This study should be mandatory reading for anyone writing a resume.
It is terrifying and clarifying all at once. Bernieri's team set out to test the exact timeline of interview judgments. They filmed dozens of actual high-stakes job interviews from start to finish. Then, they took the video files and they ruthlessly edited them. They cut them down so only the first 15 seconds of the interaction remained. Just the candidate walking through the door, offering a handshake, and sitting down. In some cases, they stripped the audio entirely.
So just pure, raw, nonverbal signaling.
Pure nonverbal data. They took these 15-second, often silent clips and showed them to a completely separate group of neutral observers who knew nothing about the candidates' resumes or the jobs they were applying for. They asked these strangers to rate the candidates on traits like competence, confidence, and ultimate employability based solely on that tiny fragment of video.
And the ratings from the strangers watching the 15-second clips, how did they compare to the actual hiring decisions made by the trained interviewers who spent an entire hour grilling the candidates?
They correlated massively. The snap judgments formed by completely uninformed strangers watching 15 seconds of a handshake strongly statistically predicted the final hiring decisions made by the executives.
Because the real interview is functionally over before the interviewer even glances at the resume and asks, "So, tell me about a time you overcame a challenge."
Essentially, yes. The defining evaluation happens in the transition space. The real interview is the physical walk from the reception area to the chair. It is the quality of the initial eye contact. It is whether the posture is expansive or contracted as they sit. It is the firmness of the handshake. Most importantly, it is the warmth and genuine engagement displayed during the throwaway small talk about the traffic, the weather, or the office layout. That tiny window is when the interviewer's bouncer decides this person is a highly competent friend or this person is an anxious foe.
And the remaining 59 minutes.
The remaining 59 minutes are just the interviewer's prefrontal cortex finding logical data to justify the bouncer's vibe check. If you nailed the first 15 seconds and established a positive halo, when you stumble slightly on a technical question in minute 40, the interviewer will help you. They will think, oh, they're just nervous, but they clearly know the core concept. If you bomb the first 15 seconds, when you give a brilliant technical answer in minute 40, the interviewer will look for flaws, thinking, they sound rehearsed, I bet they couldn't apply this in the real world.
So the actionable advice here completely flips interview prep on its head. Do not treat the small talk in the hallway as the meaningless preamble before the real test begins. The small talk is the test. You need to prepare for your entrance, your posture, and your opening Duchenne smile with the exact same obsessive intensity that you prepare for your technical case studies.
Precisely. You must win the warmth and baseline competence evaluation in the first 15 seconds, or the technical brilliance of your later answers will bounce off a wall of confirmation bias.
Okay, let's say you master the 15 seconds. You get the halo, you pass the confirmation bias, you get the job. Now you face the next high-stakes arena, the first day at the new job. And here is a psychological trap that I think almost every ambitious person falls into. You walk into the new office on Monday morning and you feel this burning, desperate internal pressure to prove that the company didn't make a massive mistake by hiring you. You want to prove you are worth the salary. You want to prove you are a genius immediately.
It is the most natural, understandable impulse in the corporate world. You want to lead with a massive demonstration of high-level competence right out of the gate. But the vast body of research on social dynamics dictates that this is the single most destructive move you can make.
Why? Shouldn't I want my new team to know I have the answers? Shouldn't I want to add value on day one?
You have to remember the biological sequence of evaluation: warmth first, competence second. Always. If you arrive on day one and immediately start pointing out inefficiencies in their legacy software, or loudly offering better solutions in the first team meeting, or aggressively showcasing your advanced technical knowledge, you are entirely bypassing the warmth check. To the established tribe that already works there, you do not look like a helpful genius. You look like an arrogant, intrusive, socially uncalibrated threat.
You are threatening their territory and their established hierarchy before they even know if you are a friend or a foe. You are triggering their bouncers.
Exactly. You are failing the fundamental survival test. The superior, deeply research-backed strategy for a first day, and realistically for the entire first month, is to lead overwhelmingly with warmth and suppress the urge to demonstrate competence. You should listen exponentially more than you speak. Ask genuine, curious questions. Defer respectfully to the existing expertise and institutional memory of the people who have been there for years. Demonstrate an intense, humble curiosity about how they do things and why they do them.
So competence literally has to wait in the wings.
Competence must wait. Warmth and curiosity are your vanguard. The person who arrives with all the answers reads as a dangerous rival. The person who arrives with deep respect and genuine interest for the existing team reads as highly trustworthy. Only after you have firmly established that you are a warm friend can you slowly, safely begin to deploy your high-level competence. When they trust you, they will welcome your ideas. Before they trust you, your ideas are weapons.
All right, let's step outside the office entirely. Let's look at purely social situations. A neighborhood party, a networking mixer, a friend's dinner. How do the mechanics shift when the stakes aren't a salary, but just social acceptance?
The underlying biological mechanics, the amygdala, the halo effect, are exactly the same. But the weighting of the scales shifts dramatically. In a purely social setting, the competence axis almost entirely disappears, and the warmth axis dictates everything.
Because nobody cares what your quarterly revenue was when you're standing around a charcuterie board in someone's kitchen.
Exactly. The survival question shifts from, can they execute, to simply, do I actually enjoy sharing physical space and time with this person? The people who make the most magnetic, overwhelmingly positive first impressions at parties are rarely the most physically attractive, the wealthiest, or the most professionally accomplished people in the room. They are the individuals who have mastered the paradox of interest.
They are the ones asking the genuinely good questions. They are the ones making other people feel like the center of the universe.
They find the genuinely fascinating kernel in the person standing across from them. And there's always something interesting if you look hard enough. They aren't executing a manipulative networking technique. They are actually experiencing a moment of real curiosity. That genuine curiosity broadcasts massive, unfakeable warmth signals through their posture, their Duchenne smiles, and their tone. It acts as a social magnet.
Okay, as we near the end of our deep dive today, I think we have a responsibility to offer a massive, comforting caveat. We have spent an hour talking about how overwhelmingly powerful these first impressions are, how they happen in a literal fraction of a second, how they dictate salaries, prison sentences, and relationships. It paints a picture of a world ruled entirely by superficial snap judgments. But we have to acknowledge the fundamental limit of all this biology. Because the greatest irony of this entire field of research is that while first impressions are incredibly powerful and incredibly sticky, they're also very frequently completely and utterly wrong.
That is the crucial saving paradox at the heart of human social cognition. We are biologically hardwired to make these rapid judgments to survive, but the actual objective accuracy of those judgments is highly, sometimes tragically, variable.
We are good at guessing a few surface things right. The research shows we aren't completely blind.
Yes, the bouncer is reasonably accurate at quickly assessing very broad, surface-level behavioral traits like extroversion or baseline anxiety. You can usually tell with fair accuracy if someone is a highly outgoing extrovert or a reserved introvert within a few minutes. The signals for those traits are loud and obvious. But for the complex, profound, deeply buried traits that actually matter over the course of a human life, true intellectual depth, long-term emotional reliability, capacity for empathy, and profound moral integrity first impressions are historically terrible, almost useless predictors.
Think about the archetype of the slick, sociopathic salesperson or the manipulative fraudster. That type of person has spent their life mastering the exact signals we've been talking about. They have the perfectly tailored suit. Yeah. They execute the firm, pressure-matched handshake flawlessly. They trigger the Duchenne smile on command. They look you dead in the eye. They come across as hyper-competent, incredibly warm, and instantly trustworthy in a 15-minute meeting. It's a masterful performance. But the underlying reality is that they might be deeply unethical and entirely unreliable.
Exactly. They are highly skilled managers of the superficial signaling system, but the underlying core substance is entirely hollow. The packaging does not match the product. And on the tragic flip side of that coin, think of the brilliant, deeply loyal, incredibly capable colleague who happens to suffer from severe social anxiety or neurodivergence. In a high-stakes first meeting, their anxiety leaks out. They avoid eye contact. Their posture is rigidly contracted. They might stumble over their opening sentence. The interviewer's bouncer immediately flags them as incompetent, cold, and untrustworthy. But that rapid biological read has absolutely nothing to do with their actual character or their capability to do brilliant work. It is just meaningless static in their signaling system.
So we exist with this massive biological blind spot. We form impressions in 100 milliseconds. They stick to our brains like superglue. They dictate massive life outcomes. And half the time, they're based on totally inaccurate readings of a person's soul. What is the long game here? If the first impression is flawed, how does reality eventually win out?
The long game is the ultimate antidote to the first impression. First impressions exert their massive power primarily in low-information, high-stakes environments. The 30-minute job interview, the first date, the elevator pitch, moments where data is scarce, but time-sustained, shared time is the great, inevitable corrector of the record.
With enough sustained interaction, the impenetrable wall of confirmation bias eventually starts to crack.
It does. It happens slowly, it happens imperfectly, and the brain fights it every step of the way because it hates admitting it was wrong, but impressions do update. When you actually work in the trenches with someone for 6 straight months, the reality of who they are overwhelms the initial snapshot. You navigate real, unpredictable stress together. You see how they handle a catastrophic failure. You see how they treat the junior intern when nobody important is watching. The initial 100-millisecond frame fades away, and it is entirely replaced by the massive, accumulated mountain of undeniable data derived from their actual daily behavior.
So a terrible, awkward, anxious first impression is not a permanent death sentence.
It is a steep hurdle. It is not an unscalable wall. Genuine, sustained excellence and true warmth will eventually overcome the initial deficit. The reality of your character will burn through the fog. And conversely, a spectacularly managed, highly manipulative, false first impression will eventually inevitably crumble under the crushing weight of sustained reality. The sociopath always reveals themselves eventually. The first impression is just the opening sentence of a much longer, vastly more complex story.
The true takeaway from all this neuroscience and psychology isn't to become some kind of Machiavellian mastermind. The goal isn't to perfectly control every microexpression, every vocal inflection, and every blink to trick people into liking a fake version of you.
Oh, no, attempting to do that is psychologically exhausting and ultimately futile, because the truth always leaks out. The true goal of understanding the mechanics of the bouncer, the halo effect, and the cultural codes is simply to learn how to remove the noise.
Mm.
You want to learn how to manage your situational anxiety, refine your baseline posture, and calibrate your cultural signals so that you aren't accidentally broadcasting false negatives. You want to clear away the static so that the best, most authentic, most accurate version of the real you can actually shine clearly through the cognitive filters of the people you meet.
Because the absolute best first impression you can possibly make is one that is simply, clearly, and undeniably true.
That is the ultimate goal. Clarity of self.
All right, I want to leave you with a direct personal challenge today. Think back to the very opening of our deep dive, that terrifying reality that you are judged, and you judge others in a fraction of a second. I want you to think about someone in your own life right now. Maybe it's a new coworker you interact with, an acquaintance on the periphery of your friend group, or someone you met at a conference. Someone who, upon your very first encounter, you immediately dismissed. You got a bad vibe, you decided they were annoying or aloof or not worth your time, and you wrote them off completely.
It's so easy to do.
It is. Knowing everything we have unpacked today, knowing how deeply flawed, how heavily reliant on superficial biases, how culturally blind, and how terrifyingly rapid your brain's biological processing truly is, I want you to pause and ask yourself a question. What if that initial bouncer at the door of your mind got it completely tragically wrong? What if the bouncer reacted to an accent or a moment of anxiety or a bad handshake and threw out the wrong person? What if that person you wrote off in the first tenth of a second is actually brilliant? What if they are exactly the kind of friend or collaborator or partner you need in your life right now?
That's a really powerful question.
Take a deliberate moment this week to look at them again. But this time, consciously turn off the cognitive Instagram filter. Bypass the bouncer. Look past the 100-millisecond judgment. You might be profoundly surprised at the incredible human being who is actually standing right there.